My penultimate question for you is regarding the shadow fleet, because we've seen some remarkable changes to this and the growing propensity for the Europeans to really clamp down much more targetedly and actively on specific assets. What impact do you think that does, one, for Putin's calculus, but two, also for demonstrating more that the Europeans do have that capability and willingness to go that far?
Well, you're absolutely right. It has a symbolic and a practical effect. And really, anything we do that shows that we're willing to accept risk and make sacrifices is a powerful signal to the Kremlin. It doesn't really matter whether we are cracking down on Russian oligarchs' abilities to sue people in London courts, whether we're cracking down on the shadow fleet, whether we're cracking down on the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, which is a means for influence, repression and intelligence gathering in other countries.
This is The Global Gambit.
Today, my guest is Edward Lucas, contributor to the London Times, Foreign Policy magazine, and a genuine expert on many things to do with NATO, Eastern Europe, and of course, the war in Ukraine. Edward, I'm delighted to have you on. The first question I really wanted to get your take on was the latest round of the trilateral talks. I appeared on French television, making an emphasis yesterday that it was mainly about leverage and bargaining power, but I'm curious how you see it.
I think that these are not really negotiations of the kind that would be needed to bring the war to the end that it so desperately needs, because I don't think that Russia has abandoned its ambition of subjugating Ukraine, and Ukraine hasn't abandoned its ambition of being an independent country. I think both sides are playing along with the idea that the talks are serious because they're trying to impress the United States, and they hope that if Donald Trump decides that the talks are failing, that he will blame either one side or the other, and they will then get some kind of geopolitical dividend out of that. But my strong assumption is that the war is going to carry on for many more months, and that these talks are fundamentally a sideshow.
Okay, but if we unpack them a little bit further, relative to a couple of weeks ago, Putin's position seems to have improved. Trump seems very persistent on having him on the board of peace or being involved in diplomatic engagement of any form. And of course, the blanketing strikes across Ukraine continue. So how do you see the position of leverage between, say, Kyiv and Moscow on Trump?
I think that Trump leans towards Russia. But I think if he was really going to pull the rug out from underneath the Ukrainians, he would have done it already. You mentioned leverage at the beginning, and I think that Trump sees international relations as a way of exercising leverage. That's why he stays in NATO. He doesn't like NATO. He doesn't see the point. He could walk out, but once you've walked out, then you've rather lost your leverage. He could have said to the Ukrainians, "You're on your own. It's up to the Europeans now," and then he'd have lost his leverage there. So Trump stays in the game. That's how he understands negotiations. He's trying to put pressure on the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are responding to that partly by going along with the talks and his critical minerals deal and so on, but also by stepping up their own efforts. And the Europeans are responding as well by increasingly filling the gap left by the United States. So Ukraine is paying a horrible price for Trump's sort of narcissistic approach to diplomacy. But I don't think it's a fundamental game changer.
No, it isn't. But I'm going to come to Europe in a second, but I want to follow up on one last angle of this, which is, how much do you think that this is Trump specifically, unilaterally thinking this on his personal relationship with Zelensky or Putin versus what his team is trying to do? We saw in the national security strategy this very remarkable outlook of the United States now, but a lot of people debate whether or not that's Trump's specific views or his broader MAGA team.
I would question how remarkable it is, really. And I think that just as our problems with Russia predate Putin and will outlast them, I think our problems with the United States predate Trump and predate Trump's first administration, that it's been clear for decades that Europe needs to do more and that we take the Americans for granted. It's been clear for decades that the Americans get a sort of geopolitical bonus by being the European security anchor, but that the cost is increasingly burdensome, given that they have other things to do in other parts of the world. And Trump expresses himself in a particularly revolting and abrasive way. But the basic message goes back many years. I think that the Europeans are now, and we'll get onto that in a moment, are responding to this in basically the right way. And the big question is whether the American withdrawal from Europe is a disorderly, chaotic and damaging and perhaps even dangerous one, or whether it's a planned, orderly shifting of the burden, which will, in the end, I think, benefit both sides.
Yeah. Now, towards Europe, of course, they are sharing more of the financial and political burden. But how much do you think the center of gravity, if we call it that, has shifted towards Europe, or it's still
Well, I don't think there's one center of gravity. Defense is a complicated business, and you have some things where the United States are still extremely important, on particularly the big expensive capabilities like heavy lift, mid-air refueling, high-end, high-tech stuff with satellites and the so-called ISTAR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and so on the size of the stockpiles and reinforcement capability. Those are all big American pluses where Europe is struggling to make up. But it's also worth noting that those are mostly things that you need if you want to do global expeditionary warfare. And Europe doesn't need to be a global military power. Europe just needs to be able to defend Europe. And that means a little bit of Arctic, a little bit about China here and there on the but that's mainly an internal problem, Chinese influence in Europe. On the military side, it's basically defending against Russia. And that's completely doable. Europe is 30 trillion GDP. It has 550 million people. They can afford quite easily to defend themselves against Russia, given enough time. The problem is trying to do that transition hurriedly.
And, well, hurriedly doesn't still seem to be the case. We saw the significant activity, shall we call it, flurry of activity around potentially freezing the assets of the Kremlin. But then what resulted was this 90 billion euro loan. And some people's opinions felt that was sort of a bit of a half-hearted attempt because, yes, it funded Ukraine, but it didn't adequately impinge on Russia's interests, or Putin's. Do you disagree with that?
You're right that what Europe does is it's far too little and it's far too late. It's also amazingly large and amazingly speedy, given the standards of the past. And if you and I had sat down 10 years ago and I'd said that Europe was going to have joint EU borrowing signed off on by the AAA countries like the Germans and the Dutch in order to fund budgetary support for Ukraine, you'd have said there's no way that's going to happen. And it just did. If I told you about SAFE, you'd have said that's never going to happen. And it just did. Now we're getting to SAFE 2. So there is, it all depends on what timescale you look at. Now, my feeling is the clock is ticking on two sides. One is that we assume Ukraine's resilience is inexhaustible, and it's certainly amazing, but there is a conceivable point at which Ukraine breaks. Maybe the life just becomes intolerable in Ukrainian cities. Maybe the military resistance becomes extremely difficult. And you could get a sharp setback. And I don't think that's at all likely, but I think Europe is assuming that it's never going to happen. And that's a dangerous assumption. And the other assumption is that the Americans will stick around for long enough for us to get our act together. And again, that's a reasonable assumption, but it's not a certainty. And what particularly worries me is that we might see, as Trump becomes more irascible and his options shrink at home, that Trump might start putting more pressure on the Europeans. And he might, for example, say, Europeans, I want you to make the Ukrainians sign the ceasefire deal. And we say we don't want to. And he says, if you don't make the Ukrainians do it, I'm going to make you. And we start seeing some severe pressure put on Europe. So that's a problem. We might see a full-on assault on the European Union's rulemaking power, because that's a big source of resistance to some of the people around Trump in the the tech world and elsewhere. We might see an ideological offensive against Europe based on sort of MAGA anti-wokery. And for any of those reasons, or others we could also discuss, Trump is able to hurt the Europeans very much by saying, I'm going to call Saka, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, back to Washington. Suddenly, NATO's just lost its sort of top brain. He could say, I'm withdrawing the American nuclear umbrella. That would be a huge blow. He could just bring home the 21st as it called, sustainment corps who do all the sort of logistics in Europe. So there's plenty he could do, and Europe's not prepared for that. Now, I think we should be a lot more worried than we are about the danger of America pulling the rug, although I still think the likelihood is they won't.
Interesting. Yeah, I think for me, it's largely been planning for the worst scenario. I think Europe should be treating this as the default scenario anyway, unfortunately. But regardless of whether Trump is going to pull the rug out or not, Europe should be fully autonomous militarily, defensively, strategically anyway. So how realistic is that? Because for me, the timescale here is that Europe is making changes, but we still need some breathing space before, the moment where Trump says, I've had enough, actually, I'm going to pull back the assets that you've referenced. How much of a timescale do you think we need to be adequately independent of the US?
I think that the full replacement of all American capabilities is several $1 trillion and 15 or 20 years. But as I said, we don't need to replicate all NATO's capabilities on the European tab. We just need to be able to defend ourselves against Russia, and we need to be able to deter Russia. Now, we've talked so far about defense. I would say that we've left it too late to build the kind of layered defense we need of everything from a proper air and missile defense, the sort of resilience to deal with hybrid attacks, the reinforcement capabilities, the military mobility, all these different elements. We're not going to get to what you might call Finland, to take Finland as a sort of exemplar of how to do defense. We're not going to get to Finland, Finnish levels in time, because Russia could be ready to attack again in 2 or 3 years, or even earlier, after a ceasefire, or it might just stage provocation while the war's still going on in Ukraine. So we don't have time to do all the stuff we need to do with regard to defence. And that means that we need to have more deterrence. And so my big priority at the moment is to try and rebuild our deterrence ladder. We need to find things that we can do that really hurt Russia and show resolve, so the Russians think, gosh, if we do that, they'll do this thing that really hurts us, so we better not do that thing to them. And at the moment, that's rather lacking. We have sanctions which are still basically bouncing off. They've impaired Putin's war machine, but they haven't crippled it. We have some sort of attempts to go after Russian proxies in the West. We don't really deal with that. We aren't really dealing with the shadow fleet, and we're not really waging political warfare inside Russia. So on the whole, Russia thinks if it does bad things to the West in the sub-threshold space, it basically gets away with them, and they're right to think that, and we need to change that perception on their part.
I remain, unfortunately, skeptical of what political opposition there remains in Russia. It's mainly sort of Garry Kasparov or entities like that, the sort of diaspora, who are the most able to... I
completely agree with you. I don't think there is only one Russian opposition. It's called the Armed Forces of Ukraine.
Well, they're the most. The Russians aren't even the third strongest army, I think, in Ukraine at this point. But after the tractors, which were stealing Russian assets, if I remember correctly. But my other question on this is, I recently spoke to David Petraeus, and one of the things I put towards him was about the operability of the EU and NATO, and he sort of emphasised that it's not really that crucial, because even if the US dilutes its influence in NATO, the European Union as the sort of economic and political hub can help sustain NATO. Do you agree with such a view, or it's more complicated than that?
Well, everything's always more complicated than than one can say in a sentence. I think that the EU is not designed to be a defence organisation, and it shouldn't become one. The EU's got plenty to do in its own wheelhouse, and it should do it better. everything from implementing the Draghi report to sorting out military mobility and building up resilience and political cohesion and so on. And of course, the EU is not the only Europe. We've got Turkey, which is extremely important, Britain, which is very important, Norway is very important. They're all outside the EU. So I wouldn't over focus on decision making in the Commission as the thing to look at. That it's very important. I think we need a range of different decision making frameworks, and the Joint Expeditionary Force is one, the Nordic Baltic 8 is another, the E3 is a third, Britain, France, and Germany.
Okay, very interesting. Go for it.
No, I don't know quite in detail what General Petraeus is thinking, but I tend to agree with him, even if I don't know the details.
No, it's more, I'll expand on it, which is something we also touched on, which is simply about this idea of a two-tiered system, because obviously, again, it doesn't revolve all around the European Union, but this concept that you could have the core entity, the core six of the EU, and then you've got the secondary tier, which involves maybe Norway or Britain, because obviously Starmer is making, I think, the right moves in trying to explore rapprochement with the European Union in Britain's own way. We have our own comparative advantages, I think, in intelligence and defence. So do you think there could be some movement there?
There is movement. I already mentioned the E3, and I understand that there's very high-level secret talks going on constantly between Britain, France, and Germany about what to do if Trump really pulls the rug, and both in terms of reassuring the public, signaling to Russia, and making the sort of practical changes that are going to be needed. We've got the European political community, which is the French-led sort of big Europe framework. We've got variable geometry inside the EU with Hungary and to an extent Slovakia taking sort of opt-out when it comes to things to do with Russia and Ukraine. So I think there's plenty going on. I would like to up the tempo, but as I said a few minutes earlier, compared to where we were in most of the last 20 years, this is astonishing progress and astonishing speed of change. I just wish it hadn't been bought at the price of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians killed, maimed, immiserated, bereaved, and so on. So we should not be complacent about this. Our geopolitical education is coming at an extremely high price, mostly paid for by somebody else.
No, indeed. I think my penultimate question for you is regarding the shadow fleet, because we've seen some remarkable changes to this and the growing propensity for the Europeans to really clamp down much more targetedly and actively on specific assets. What impact do you think that does, one, for Putin's calculus, but two, also for demonstrating more that the Europeans do have that capability and willingness to go that far?
Well, you're absolutely right. It has a symbolic and a practical effect. And really anything we do that shows that we're willing to accept risk and make sacrifices is a powerful signal to the Kremlin. And it doesn't really matter whether we're cracking down on Russian oligarchs' abilities to sue people in London courts, whether we're cracking down on the shadow fleet, whether we're cracking down on the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, which is a means for influence, repression, and intelligence gathering in other countries. Whatever you choose, any one of 20 things, but just do it and show you're serious, and that immediately signals the Kremlin, watch out, they're getting their act together. Now, with the shadow fleet, the sort of practical thing is it hits the money. The flow of money into Russia is very tightly linked to the flow of hydrocarbons out of Russia. And there's plenty we can do on that. I wish we'd gone after the shadow fleet earlier. But I would also say it's not a panacea. And we've tended to make the mistake in our dealings with Russia. We think, here's the big red button. We hit that and Putin's toast. And it doesn't work like that. People thought that chucking Russia out of SWIFT would be the big red button, and that the Russian economy would simply collapse if it was knocked out of SWIFT. Turns out that didn't happen. We thought if we stop buying pipeline natural gas, that'll be the end. So there's always a danger to overestimate the importance of any one thing. But I still think that if you do something and do it consequently, You send a powerful signal to your own people that we're serious about this. You send a powerful signal to allies, and you send a powerful signal to the Kremlin. And the weakness of the approach so far has been a sort of salami slicing. We've actually done, as I said, an amazing number of things over the last 4 or 5 years. But by doing them bit by bit, you don't have the same impact as if you did them with a bigger bang.
No, and I think people have grossly misunderstood the idea of what it means to be Russian, or the idea of Russian resilience. The Russian people are very used to suffering, right? One guest I had said they're professional sufferers. I'm
very cautious about this. I think there's this sort of Orientalist approach, which can be both comforting and patronizing and deceptive all at the same time. So I've never believed this idea that Russia is a mystery wrapped in an enigma, in a riddle. This is all sort of, this mystification of Russia gets me extremely nervous and upset. And lots of countries have amazing abilities to suffer. Let's hope to God it doesn't happen to us. But I'm very cautious about this sort of idea that Russia is some kind of special place with special people who think in a special way and will react with special reactions to our way we behave. We should be ruthlessly logical, try and be very well informed in our dealings with Russia. But I don't think this sort of Orientalist sort of hoopla necessarily is a very good guide.
I wouldn't. An Orientalist is an interesting way to frame it. I've never thought of it like that. But
well, it is. If you think about it, no, sorry, it's a very important point. We are patronising towards the countries of Central Eastern Europe in a way that would be a career killer if you did it towards the countries of Africa. Can you imagine an African Borat? Some privileged Western Africa making fun of an African country the way that Borat makes fun of Kazakhstan. So we have an absolute blind spot when it comes to this patronising attitude, both to our allies and to our foes. I think is at the heart of the many, many mistakes we've made since 1991.
I think that's a very refreshing take that a lot of people would appreciate, Edward. But the last point I have for you is then simply just, what would you mainly emphasise viewers and listeners to keep a lookout for? Obviously, we'll have you back hopefully soon to cover some more developments. But what would you emphasise to people to keep a lookout for, especially given the harshness of the winter?
I suppose, one important thing which I'm working on is that we don't treat Russia as if it's invincible. And there's a lot of very stupid commentary around at the moment about how, Narva, the Estonian border city, is next, or the Suwałki Gap, so-called, which is actually the Suwałki-Alytus corridor, is sitting duck. Don't patronise the Baltic states. They think about this all the time. They will not be caught by surprise. Actually, I don't think we have a problem in the Baltic. I think we have a solution in the Baltic. And I think if we could adopt the sort of vigilance and readiness and resilience that we have in the countries from Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, down to Poland, we'd be in much better shape. So I think a bit less scaremongering and patronising behaviour in the West, and a bit more willingness to learn from the countries that are in the geographical front line is highly overdue.
Very, very pertinent words, and I think very reflective of what's been said by Alexander Stubb, Mark Carney to an extent. Very, very important final words. But Edward Lucas, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. We look forward to having you back. Take care.
Thank you.